Welcome to Unit 3, Week 1, Rosie the Riveter Talks, the ultimate in low-budget history studying and review. This is Unit 3, Week 1, question number 1. One of the 4 original departments, cabinet agencies, assisters for Washington, because he can appoint advisors according to the Constitution, only with the confirmation of the Senate. So the 4 original departments were the Department of State, because the President has all the power in foreign affairs. The original Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. Mr. I was over in France loving the French food during the Constitutional Convention anyways. Number 2 department, the Department of War. We've renamed that in the 1940s Department of Defense. Sounds better and less offensive, I suppose, than the Department of War. And that was headed by Henry Knox. The 3rd department was the Department of the Treasury. All about the economic model for the country and who was Mr. I want central economic power. I want to cover the debts. I want to get the United States as a fiscally stable, responsible nation with lots of central power. Hamilton. And finally, the 4th department was the Attorney General, the legal advisor to the President, the head of the Department of Justice, technically the Secretary of Justice, but it's the only cabinet officer that doesn't go by secretary. The Attorney General was Edmund Randolph. Funny, he's the legal advisor on the Constitution, and he didn't even sign the original thing at the Constitutional Convention, even though it's his own Virginia plan that went into it. So there are 4. War, Knox. Treasury, Hamilton. Secretary of State, Jefferson. And Secretary of Treasury, Hamilton. And that's it, from some guy in a Hawaiian shirt. Alright, welcome to Unit 3, Week 1, question number 2. Since it's a prime number, I have a rubber duck. Alright, how did Alexander Hamilton propose to solve the national crisis? Well, financial crisis. This is the guy who wants all the power in the central government, all the power in one spot. Essentially, there was like a $50-some million debt for the country, owed for blowing up British soldiers, borrowed from foreign countries in private citizens. He also wanted to add even more debt. He wanted the government in charge of everything, including recovering from debt. What had happened was people had loaned the government money. They'd taken out bonds. They bought bonds. After the war, not James Bonds, those are different. After the war, people were buying them off. The government wasn't paying the people back. So these private citizens, these little independent soldiers who loaned the government money to get paid back with interest later, had an empty bond, an IOU that had never been paid. They're poor. So instead of getting $100, $10, whatever back for their bond, they sold them for pennies to private investors who said, this bond supposedly is worth $100. I'm going to buy it for, $1. The poorest individual farmer said, well, I can have an IOU that's worth $100 that no one's paying me, or I can have $1 in my hand. I'll take the dollar. So individual people had piled up large numbers of bonds. They were gambling, of course, that someday they might be paid back in full. And so what happened was the government decided to pay them back in full. Small farmers were outraged. Individual citizens were outraged. Hamilton thought the idea was that if he can have the rich investors who risk their own money to buy up all of these bonds, if he can have them loyal to the government, then the government will be stable. So the government promised to pay back in full the people who bought them for pennies on the dollar. And on top of that, Hamilton said, why don't we take over the state debt? The states were like, sure, here, federal government, you want to owe money? Have money you owe. Hamilton was sneaky, though. His real idea was that if the rich are getting paid back by the federal government, they're going to want the federal government to be stable, to be solid. And over time it was. And on top of that, how did he pay them back with no money? He borrowed even more. But since people were getting paid back in full, they trusted the government. So they loaned the government money, maybe at 8% the first time. Then if they're getting paid back, there's more trust. We'll loan it at 7%. So over time, he's paying back money the government owes by borrowing money cheaper. He's paying people back the 10, 12% they were owed, but borrowing money at 7 or 8%. So over time, the government pays off its debt. The rich are getting back the money that they invested, so they're loyal to the country. And the federal government is more powerful and stable because now that's the one that people owe money to. So Hamilton made a stable national government, a strong economy, and on top of that, gave power to the central government, and a national bank would be in charge and be powerful. And this national bank is what he wanted to be managing the country's economy and affairs. And that's it from some guy in a Hawaiian shirt. All right, this is Unit 3, Week 1, question number 3. How did Hamilton and Jefferson disagree about the interpretation of the elastic clause? Yeah, same thing, prime number. Anyways, the necessary and proper clause, the elastic clause, Article 1, Section 8, powers of Congress. Hamilton thought the national government should be powerful, so therefore he was a very loose interpretation of the Constitution. Necessary and proper could be broadly interpreted to give the federal, central, national government more and more power, to make the central national government the most significant one in the country. Jefferson, on the other hand, was a strict interpretationist. What did that mean? He thought the Constitution, if it said Congress can establish post offices, that was it. Congress could not do other powers broadly beyond that. Jefferson specifically thought that the Constitution gives the federal government only the powers written in the Constitution. So the necessary and proper was pretty mild, shouldn't be expanded. He wanted power in the hands of the average people and the states. Jefferson wanted central national. Jefferson thought, what would happen if we accepted Hamilton's view? We'd have an overly dominant near monarchy. We'd have rebellion. We wouldn't have the right to the small states, the right to the people. These guys hated each other. From their two philosophies, though, are born the two different political parties in the United States. Not the Democrats and Republicans of today, but the first two parties. The Democratic Republicans of Jefferson and the Federalists of Hamilton. So that's how they disagreed about the elastic clause, and that's it from some guy in a Hawaiian shirt. Welcome to Unit 3, Week 1, question number 4. What was the Whiskey Rebellion? In a simple nutshell, angry farmers didn't want to pay taxes. George Washington went out with the army. They decided, ooh, he means business. Maybe we should pay taxes. What did this really mean? The central government was able to establish its power and able to prove that it could enforce the law. If farmers, no, farming hat, farmers grew whiskey. Actually, you can't. Whiskey's alcohol, but it's refined from, it's called grain alcohol. It comes from a grain. Wheat farmers, way out in western Pennsylvania, brewed all their wheat into whiskey. It was easier to transport a small vat or barrel of whiskey across the mountains to where the people lived on the East Coast than it was to transport tons and tons of loose grain of wheat. So these farmers took their wheat and converted it into whiskey and sold it into the western half, into the eastern half of the United States on the coast where all the people were. Well, the government needed revenue. It decided to tax whiskey 25%. Whiskey farmers were outraged. This is unfair. This is just on us. They were going to refuse to pay the tax. So Washington took himself as commander-in-chief of the army, Article 2 power, along with Alexander Hamilton, me too, boss, central power, please, off on his horse, and they rode out with 12,900 soldiers to western Pennsylvania, where these farmers who weren't going to follow the government, they decided to pay up and shut up when the commander-in-chief showed up on his horse.